The coffee mug felt cold in my hands as I stared at the divorce papers scattered across our granite kitchen counter. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up each document, the legal terminology swimming before my eyes like a foreign language I'd never learned to speak. Outside, Seattle's October rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of our Queen Anne home, creating rivulets that distorted the city skyline beyond. The Space Needle stood like a lonely sentinel in the gray, morning light, its familiar silhouette now seeming alien and unwelcoming. The irony wasn't lost on me. After 12 years of marriage, our relationship had become just as blurred and fractured as that rain-streaked view. I thought about the morning ritual we used to share in this very kitchen. Mark would make his protein smoothie while I prepared my elaborate coffee with steamed milk and a dash of cinnamon. We'd read different sections of the Seattle Times, occasionally sharing interesting headlines or laughing at the same comic strip. Those quiet moments had felt like the foundation of our life together, steady, comfortable, permanent. Now, sitting alone with divorce papers as my only companion, I wondered if even those memories were lies. "Olivia, we need to talk." Mark's voice cut through the morning silence like a blade, sharp and precise in the way that had once attracted me, but now made me flinch. He stood in the doorway, impeccably dressed in his charcoal Tom Ford suit, the one I'd helped him pick out for his promotion interview 2 years ago. His briefcase was the Italian leather one I'd given him for his 35th birthday, now scratched and worn from constant use. He looked every inch the successful tech executive he'd become, with his perfectly styled dark hair showing just the right amount of silver at the temples, his clean-shaven jaw set in determination. But there was something different about his demeanor today, an urgency that made my stomach clench with dread. His usually confident posture seemed forced, and there was a tightness around his eyes that I'd learned to associate with his worst moods. I looked up from the papers, my green eyes meeting his steel-gray ones across the expanse of our kitchen. Island. The same island where we'd shared so many meals, where he'd surprised me with birthday cakes, where we'd planned vacations that now seemed like elaborate performances. About what? The fact that you want to finalize this divorce in 3 weeks instead of taking the time to do it properly? My voice carried more bite than I intended, but I was exhausted from months of his increasingly erratic behavior. The late nights, the weekend emergencies at work, the way he'd started speaking to me like a business associate rather than his wife. Most couples take months to work through a divorce, Mark. Some take years. But you want everything signed and sealed before Halloween? Mark set his briefcase down with deliberate precision, a habit I'd once found endearing but now recognized as calculated control. Every movement was measured, every gesture designed to project authority and competence. It was the same corporate persona he wore to board meetings, and seeing it directed at me in our kitchen felt like a slap. Look, I know this seems rushed, but dragging this out isn't helping either of us. We both want to move on with our lives. The longer we stay in this limbo, the more painful it becomes for everyone involved. His words sounded rehearsed, like a presentation he'd practiced in the mirror. I wondered how many times he'd run through this conversation in his head, perfecting his tone and timing. The man I'd fallen in love with used to stumble over his words when he was nervous, would run his hands through his hair and pace around the room. This controlled, calculated version of Mark felt like a stranger wearing my husband's face. Dewey? I stood up, my silk robe catching the morning light that filtered through our rain-soaked windows. The robe had been a gift from Mark 3 Christmases ago, purchased during what I now realized was probably the last time he'd put genuine thought into something for me. At 34, I still turned heads when I walked into a room, my auburn, hair cascading over my shoulders in waves that caught fire in the sunlight, my figure maintained through years of yoga and Pilates. But lately, I felt invisible in my own home, like a ghost haunting the life I used to live. Because it seems like you're the only one in a hurry here, Mark. Almost like you have somewhere else to be. Someone else to be with, perhaps? The accusation hung in the air between us, heavy and dangerous. I hadn't meant to voice that particular suspicion, but months of Mark's strange behavior had planted seeds of doubt that were growing into something uglier. The mysterious phone calls he'd taken in his study with the door closed. The way he'd started password protecting his laptop, claiming it was for security reasons. The subtle changes in his grooming habits. New cologne, more attention to his appearance, designer clothes that seemed chosen to impress someone other than his wife. His jaw tightened, a tell I'd learned to read over the years, like a poker player studying their opponent's unconscious habits. When Mark was lying or hiding something, a small muscle in his jaw would contract, creating a barely visible twitch near his left ear. He'd done it when he lied about the dent in his BMW. He'd done it when he claimed he'd forgotten our anniversary, dinner reservations. And he was doing it now. Don't be dramatic, Liv. This is about being practical. The longer we drag this out, the more expensive it gets for both of us. Legal fees, court costs, all the complications that come with extended proceedings. But something in his tone didn't sit right. Mark had never worried about money before, not once in our 12 years together. As the VP of Product Development at TechFlow Dynamics, he pulled in a 7-figure salary that afforded us luxuries most people only dreamed of. Our combined assets were substantial. The house worth $2 million, his extensive stock options that vested annually, my successful interior design firm that had grown from a one-woman operation to a team of 12 employees. We drove luxury cars, took international vacations, and never questioned the cost of anything. Why the sudden concern about legal fees? "Since when do you worry about expenses?" I asked, crossing my arms and studying his face for more tells. "Last month, you bought that Rolex without blinking. The month before that, you dropped $8,000 on golf equipment you've used exactly twice. You spend more on wine in a year than most people make in 6 months. That's different." He glanced at his watch. Not the Rolex, I noticed, with growing suspicion, but his old Omega Seamaster, the one he'd worn in college. The Rolex had been a celebration purchase when he'd gotten his promotion, a symbol of his success and our shared prosperity. Why was he wearing the old watch now? "I just think clean breaks are better, less messy, less opportunity for things to get complicated." The word messy hung in the air between us like a loaded weapon, sharp and threatening. Our marriage hadn't been messy. It had been slowly suffocating under the weight of Mark's increasing distance and my growing loneliness. He'd grown distant over the past year, working later hours that stretched into the early morning, taking business trips that seemed to multiply each month, speaking in corporate jargon even at home, as if our kitchen had become another conference room. The man I'd fallen in love with at 22, the one who used to surprise me with handwritten notes hidden in my purse, who planned spontaneous weekend getaways to the San Juan Islands, who once drove 3 hours to bring me soup when I had the flu. That man had transformed into someone I barely recognized. "Fine," I said, though every instinct screamed against it. "But I want everything clearly documented. Assets, debts, everything." Relief flickered across his features so quickly I almost missed it. "Of course. My lawyer will handle all the paperwork." "Your lawyer?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "We agreed on mediation, Mark. Collaborative divorce, remember? Keep it amicable?" "Things change." He picked up his briefcase again. "Brad Morrison is the best divorce attorney in Seattle. He'll make sure everything is fair." Brad Morrison. I knew that name. Ruthless, expensive, and definitely not the type of lawyer you hire for an amicable split. My heart began to race, but I kept my expression neutral. "I see. Well, then I suppose I should get my own representation, if you think that's necessary." He was already moving toward the door, eager to escape. "I've got to run. Conference call with Tokyo in 20 minutes. As his footsteps echoed through our spacious foyer, each step deliberately measured on the Italian marble we'd chosen together during our house hunting phase 5 years ago, I remained frozen in the kitchen, the divorce papers seeming to multiply. Before my eyes, like some kind of legal hydra, something was wrong, terribly, fundamentally wrong. The Mark I'd married wouldn't have hired a shark like Morrison for an amicable divorce. The Mark I'd married wouldn't have been wearing his college watch instead of his prized Rolex. The Mark I'd married wouldn't have looked at me with such cold calculation when discussing the end of our life together. I walked to the kitchen window, pressing my forehead against the cool glass and watching the rain create abstract patterns on the surface. Our backyard garden was a riot of fall colors. The Japanese maple I'd planted for our 5th anniversary, now blazing red and gold, the rose bushes heavy with late-season blooms that would soon succumb to Seattle's winter. I'd built this garden with my own hands, spending weekends covered in soil and sunshine, creating something beautiful that would last. Now it felt like a monument to naive optimism. I picked up my phone and dialed my best friend, Sarah Chen, who answered on the second ring with the groggy irritation of someone yanked from deep sleep. "Girl, it's not even 8 a.m. This better be good." Sarah's voice was thick with sleep, but I could hear concern creeping in as her investigative journalist. Instincts kicked into gear. Sarah worked for the Seattle Times, covering white-collar crime and political corruption. If anyone could smell a rat, it was her. Mark's trying to rush the divorce. He hired Brad Morrison. The silence on the other end was telling. Then, "Morrison? The shark? Oh, honey, no. That man doesn't do quickie divorces for altruistic reasons. Morrison specializes in high-asset cases where someone's trying to hide something big. I covered a case last year where he helped a tech CEO hide $20 million from his ex-wife through offshore accounts in shell companies." Sarah's voice was fully alert now, sharp with professional interest. "What's Mark hiding?" That was the question that had been gnawing at me for weeks, growing from a whisper of doubt into a roar of certainty. I walked to our home office, a room that had once been our shared space, but had gradually become Mark's domain through a process so subtle I hadn't noticed until it was complete. My design books had been relegated to a small shelf in the corner. My desk had been replaced with a larger one, for his work needs. Even the art on the walls had changed from the colorful abstracts I loved to corporate-approved prints that could have come from any office building downtown. His desk was meticulously organized with the obsessive precision of someone who had important things to hide. Password-protected laptop closed and locked to the desk with a security cable he'd installed last month. Important documents locked away in a filing cabinet I'd never had reason to access, and now realized I'd been systematically excluded from. Even his coffee mug sat at a precise angle, as if he'd used a protractor to position it correctly. "I don't know, but I'm going to find out," I said, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. "Be careful, Liv. If Morrison's involved, this isn't going to be the friendly divorce you hoped for." After hanging up, I stood in the office doorway, rain still pattering against the windows. The house felt different now, less like a home and more like a crime scene waiting to be investigated. I thought about our joint accounts, our shared investments, the business we'd built together. My interior design firm, Refined Spaces, had grown substantially over the past few years, with high-profile clients throughout the Pacific Northwest. But Mark had always handled our finances, claiming his business background made him better suited for investment decisions. Trust. It was such a fragile thing, and once cracked, impossible to ignore. I'd trusted Mark with everything, my heart, my home, my financial future. But trust, I was beginning to realize, might have been my biggest mistake. I made myself another cup of coffee and sat down at my laptop. If Mark wanted to play games, he was about to learn that I wasn't the same naive 22-year-old he'd married. I'd built a successful business from nothing, navigated complex client relationships, and managed million-dollar renovation projects. I was more than capable of protecting myself. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was protecting myself from. The rain continued to fall, washing away the last remnants of the life I'd thought I knew. While somewhere in the distance, I could swear I heard the sound of time running out. The Seattle Public Library's downtown branch felt like a fortress of knowledge as I settled into a quiet corner on the 4th floor, my laptop open, and a stack of legal books beside me that I'd collected from 3 different floors. The building hummed with the quiet energy of people pursuing their own investigations. Students researching papers, job seekers updating resumes, elderly patrons reading newspapers from around the world. 3 days had passed since Mark's bombshell about Brad Morrison, and I'd spent every spare moment researching divorce law, asset protection, and red flags to watch for during marital dissolution. The legal terminology that had seemed foreign just days ago was beginning to make terrifying sense. Fraudulent transfer, asset dissipation, marital waste. Each phrase represented a different way for one spouse to financially destroy the other, and I was learning them all with the grim efficiency of someone studying for the most important test of her life. What I'd learned made my blood run cold. According to the American Academy of Matrimonial Lawyers, financial fraud occurs in over 40% of high-asset divorces. Husbands were more likely to hide assets than wives, often beginning the process 6 months to 2 years before filing for divorce. The methods were sophisticated and numerous. Offshore accounts, cryptocurrency investments, inflated business expenses, fake loans to friends or family members, even purchasing expensive items that could be easily liquidated later. Dissipation of marital assets. The phrase echoed in my mind as I scrolled through case studies of spouses who'd been cleaned out by partners preparing for divorce. Hidden accounts, transferred assets, inflated business expenses. The playbook was disturbingly familiar. 1. Case involved a software executive who'd moved $3 million through 17 different accounts before his wife caught on. Another detailed a restaurant owner who'd claimed massive business losses while secretly funneling profits into cryptocurrency wallets his wife couldn't access. But what struck me most was how similar all these cases were to my own situation. The rushing timeline, the expensive, aggressive lawyers, the sudden concern about complications and keeping things simple. It was like reading a manual for financial fraud disguised as divorce strategy. My phone buzzed with a text from Mark. Working late again, client emergency in Tokyo, don't wait up. The 3rd working late message this week, and it was only Wednesday. I screenshot the text and added it to a growing folder on my phone labeled Evidence, a folder that Sarah had suggested I start maintaining. Her investigative journalist instincts were proving invaluable as she coached me through the process of documenting everything that seemed suspicious or out of character. You need a professional, she'd said yesterday over lunch at our favorite cafe on Capitol Hill. Someone who knows how to trace financial breadcrumbs. I can't afford to hire a private investigator on top of a divorce attorney, I'd protested. You can't afford not to, Sarah had countered, sliding a business card across the table. Rachel Winters. She's a certified fraud examiner and financial investigator, used to work for the FBI's white-collar crime unit. Now, staring at Rachel's card, I felt the weight of decision pressing down on me. Once I made this call, there would be no going back to pretending everything was fine. I dialed before I could lose my nerve. Winters Investigations. This is Rachel. Ms. Winters. My name is Olivia Sterling. I think my husband is hiding assets before our divorce, and I need help. Can you meet tomorrow at 10 a.m.? My office is in Belltown. Rachel Winters looked nothing like the grizzled private detective I'd imagined from too many noir films and crime novels. In her early 40s, she had sharp blue eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of a room within seconds of entering. Silver-streaked blonde hair pulled back in a professional bun that suggested both competence and no-nonsense efficiency, and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen every dirty trick in the book, twice. She wore a crisp white blouse and navy blazer that could have belonged to any business executive. But there was something in her posture that spoke of someone accustomed to danger, someone who'd spent years chasing down people who thought they were smarter than the system. Her office was sparse but efficient. 2 large monitors displaying real-time financial charts and data streams, A whiteboard covered in what looked like a complex money trail with arrows and dates connecting various banks and corporations, and shelves lined with legal texts, investigative manuals, and what appeared to be several awards from law enforcement agencies. A framed photograph on her desk showed her shaking hands with what looked like an FBI director, and another showed her testifying before what appeared to be a congressional committee. "Tell me about your husband's recent behavior," Rachel said, fingers poised over her keyboard with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd conducted thousands of these interviews. "Start with when you first noticed something was wrong, and walk me through every detail, no matter how small it might seem." I walked her through the timeline with the methodical precision of someone who'd been preparing for this conversation for days. Mark's increasing secrecy over the past 8 months, the rushed divorce announcement, the expensive lawyer who specialized in hiding assets, the mysterious working late nights that had become the norm rather than the exception. I told her about the subtle changes in his behavior, the way he'd started closing his laptop whenever I entered the room, how he'd moved important mail to a P.O. box I'd only discovered by accident, the fact that he'd changed all our account passwords without telling me, claiming it was for security purposes. "What's his income situation?" Rachel asked, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she created what appeared to be a comprehensive profile. "Base salary of $850,000, but with performance bonuses and stock options, he usually makes around $1.2 million annually. This year might be higher, because TechFlow had an exceptional quarter, and he's eligible for additional equity compensation." The numbers felt surreal as I spoke them aloud. 5 years ago, when Mark had first joined TechFlow, we'd celebrated his $200,000 salary as if we'd won the lottery. The rapid growth of his income had happened so gradually that I'd stopped thinking about how wealthy we'd become. Rachel's eyebrows rose slightly. "And your joint assets?" "The house is worth about $2 million. We have maybe $400,000 in savings and checking accounts, another $600 in investment portfolios. Mark's 401k is substantial, probably close to $800,000. Plus there's my business. Any recent large purchases or unusual expenses?" I thought about it. He bought that Rolex I mentioned, $15,000, but that's not unusual for him. "What about business trips, entertainment expenses?" "More than usual, but he says it's because he's being considered for a promotion to senior VP. Rachel leaned back in her chair. "Mrs. Sterling, in my experience, when a high-earning spouse suddenly wants a rush divorce while hiring an aggressive attorney, they're usually preparing for something. The question is what?" She pulled up a complex-looking software program. "I'm going to need authorization to examine your joint accounts, credit reports, and any business records you have access to. What I'm looking for are patterns, unusual transfers, new accounts, inflated expenses." The next week passed in a blur of financial archaeology. Rachel worked with the precision of a surgeon, dissecting years of bank statements, credit card bills, and investment records. I provided everything I could access, while she used her professional tools to dig deeper. On Friday afternoon, she called with an urgent request to meet, her voice carrying the kind of controlled excitement that suggested she'd found something significant. "I found something," Rachel said without preamble when I arrived at her office 30 minutes later, my heart racing from both the speed at which I'd driven across town and the anticipation of finally having answers. "And it's worse than I thought, much worse." She turned her monitor toward me, showing a spreadsheet with dozens of highlighted entries in different colors: yellow for suspicious transactions, red for confirmed fraudulent transfers, green for legitimate business expenses that had been artificially inflated. The document looked like a roadmap to financial destruction, each colored cell representing another piece of our shared wealth that had been systematically stolen. "Over the past 6 months, your husband has systematically moved money out of your joint accounts. Small amounts at first, $5,000 here, $10,000 there, amounts that might look like normal business expenses or investment diversification. Recently, the transfers have gotten larger and more frequent." My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I wondered if Rachel could hear it. "How much?" "So far, about $250,000, But Mrs. Sterling, that's just the money I can definitively trace. Based on the patterns I'm seeing and some gaps in the documentation, I suspect the actual amount is significantly higher. The room seemed to tilt. Where did it go? That's where it gets interesting. Rachel pulled up another screen. Most of it went to a business account for something called Sterling Consulting LLC. Sterling Consulting? That's not one of our businesses. No, but according to state records, it was registered 3 months ago. The sole owner is listed as Mark Sterling. I felt sick. He created a company and has been funneling our money into it. It gets worse. Rachel's expression was grim. I also found evidence of inflated expense reports submitted to his company. Hotel bills for business trips that cost 3 times what they should. Restaurant receipts for client dinners that happened on weekends when you thought he was working late. The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. He's been stealing from his own company, too. Potentially. But here's the real kicker. I traced some payments from Sterling Consulting to a property management company in Bellevue. Rent payments for a high-end apartment. My vision blurred. He has an apartment, a very nice one. 2 bedrooms, luxury building, $1,800 a month. And Mrs. Sterling? Rachel paused, her voice gentler now. The lease shows 2 occupants. The words hit me like a physical blow. Not only was Mark stealing from us, he was living a double life. While I'd been agonizing over the breakdown of our marriage, he'd been playing house with someone else, funding it with money stolen from our joint accounts. I need names, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm working on that. But Mrs. Sterling, there's something else. Rachel pulled up a calendar on her computer. Based on the timing of these transfers and the lease agreement, I believe your husband has been planning this for at least 6 months. The rushed divorce isn't impulsive. It's calculated. He wants to finalize everything before I discover what he's done. Exactly. And given the amount of money involved and the complexity of what he's set up, I suspect there's more we haven't found yet. I sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of Mark's betrayal. This wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was a carefully orchestrated financial crime. What are my options? I asked finally. Rachel leaned forward, her eyes sharp with professional focus. We document everything, gather more evidence, and then you need to act fast. If he's planning to finalize the divorce quickly, he probably has an exit strategy that involves liquidating or hiding even more assets. How do I stop him? You freeze everything he has access to: joint accounts, credit cards, investment portfolios. Cut off his ability to move any more money. Can I do that legally? With the right court orders, absolutely. But you'll need to move quickly, and you'll need a lawyer who's not afraid to fight dirty. As I left Rachel's office, Seattle's skyline looked different, sharper, more dangerous. The city I'd called home for over a decade now felt like enemy territory, with my own husband as the threat I'd never seen coming. That evening, I sat in our kitchen where this nightmare had begun, staring at the divorce papers that now seemed like props in an elaborate con game. Mark's rushed timeline wasn't about moving on. It was about moving out with as much of our money as possible. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated me. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for Amanda Rodriguez, a divorce attorney Sarah had recommended. If Mark wanted to play games, it was time to change the rules. The rain had stopped, and for the first time in weeks, I could see clearly through our windows. Seattle's lights sparkled in the distance, and I realized that somewhere out there, my husband was living a lie that was about to come crashing down around him. Game on, Mark. Game on. The law offices of Rodriguez and Associates occupied the 32nd floor of the Columbia Center, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of Elliott Bay. Amanda Rodriguez was everything Mark's lawyer probably wasn't expecting. Sharp as a blade, strategically minded, and absolutely fearless when it came to protecting her clients from financial predators. Mrs. Sterling, Amanda said, reviewing the evidence Rachel had compiled. Your husband has committed several serious crimes. Wire fraud, embezzlement, potentially tax evasion. This goes far beyond marital misconduct. I sat across from her mahogany desk, feeling more empowered than I had in months. What's our next move? We file for emergency relief. Asset freezing orders, temporary restraining orders preventing any further transfers, and we demand full financial disclosure under penalty of perjury. Amanda's dark eyes glittered with the anticipation of battle. But first, we need to be absolutely certain we've found everything. Rachel, who'd joined us for this strategy session, pulled out her tablet. I've identified at least 3 more suspicious accounts, and I'm tracking what appears to be cryptocurrency transactions. Mark's been busy. Crypto? I felt my stomach drop again. It's the new frontier for hiding assets in divorce, Amanda explained. Harder to trace, easier to conceal, but not impossible to recover if we move fast. Over the next 72 hours, our team worked with military precision. Rachel continued her financial archaeology while Amanda prepared our legal assault. I played my part by acting normal, or at least as normal as possible when your entire world was imploding. Mark seemed oblivious to the storm brewing around him. He came home late each night, claiming exhaustion from work, while I smiled and nodded and documented everything. His overconfidence was becoming his weakness. How's the divorce paperwork? Coming along? He asked casually. Thursday morning, not looking up from his phone as he ate breakfast. Amanda's reviewing everything, I said truthfully. She wants to make sure we don't miss anything important. Amanda? My attorney. You didn't think I'd go through this without representation, did you? For just a moment, his composed facade cracked. I thought we agreed on mediation. We did. Then you hired Brad Morrison. I sipped my coffee, watching his reaction carefully. Funny thing, Amanda knows Brad. Says he specializes in high-asset divorces where one spouse is trying to hide money. Mark's knuckles went white around his coffee. Mugwump, I'm not hiding anything, Olivia. I just want this done efficiently. Of course you do. That afternoon, Amanda called with news that made my pulse race. We're ready. Rachel found 2 more offshore accounts and evidence of a shell company in Delaware. Your husband has moved over. $400,000 out of your reach. 400,000? The number stole my breath. That's just what we've found so far. Mrs. Sterling, I need you to understand. Once we file these motions, your marriage is officially at war. Are you prepared for that? I thought about the apartment in Bellevue, the secret bank accounts, the lies told to my face every single day. I'm ready. Friday morning, while Mark was at his weekly department meeting, Amanda filed our emergency motions with King County Superior Court. By noon, we had our temporary restraining orders. By 2 p.m., every bank that held our joint accounts had been notified of the asset freeze. I was in my office at Refined Spaces, reviewing designs for a waterfront penthouse project, when my phone exploded with calls. Mark's name flashed on the screen 6 times before I finally answered. What the hell did you do? His voice was raw with panic and rage. I protected myself, I said calmly, though my heart was hammering. Did you really think I wouldn't notice? $400,000 missing from our accounts. Silence. Then, you hired a private investigator. I hired a financial forensic expert. Turns out I needed one. Olivia, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. My voice gained strength with each word. I understand that while I was trying to save our marriage, you were systematically stealing from me. I understand that you've been living with someone else while telling me you were working late. I understand that you created fake companies and fake expenses to hide money that belongs to both of us. Another long silence. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted from anger to something more dangerous. Calculation. You can't prove any of that. Actually, I can. Sterling Consulting, LLC. The apartment on 106th Avenue. The crypto wallets. Should I continue? I heard him take a sharp breath. Meet me at home. We need to talk. No, Mark. We're done talking. From now on, we communicate through our attorneys. Olivia, please. I hung up. Within an hour, Brad Morrison's office was calling Amanda, demanding emergency hearings and claiming the asset freeze was punitive and unfair. Amanda fielded the calls with professional satisfaction. They're panicking, she told me during our afternoon briefing. Morrison's talking about temporary financial difficulties and misunderstandings about marital property. Classic deflection tactics. What happens next? Monday morning, we have a hearing. Mark will try to get the freeze lifted and claim this is all a big misunderstanding. We'll present our evidence and let the judge decide who's telling the truth. That weekend was the longest of my life. Mark didn't come home Friday night or Saturday. His absence felt like both a relief and a confession. I walked through our house. My house now, I realized, seeing it with new eyes. All the luxury we'd accumulated, the art we'd chosen together, the life we'd built. How much of it had been financed by his theft? Sarah came over Saturday evening with Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine. How are you holding up? She asked, settling into our living room's plush sectional. I feel like I'm living in someone else's life, I admitted. 3 weeks ago, I thought my biggest problem was a distant husband. Now I find out he's a criminal. He underestimated you, Sarah said, raising her wine glass in a mock toast. Men like Mark always do. They think we're decorative accessories who won't fight back. He's about to learn otherwise. Sunday afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. I was in my garden, trying to find peace among my roses when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw a woman I didn't recognize. Petite, blonde, probably in her late 20s, with the kind of nervous energy that screamed trouble. I opened the door cautiously. Can I help you? Are you Olivia Sterling? Her voice was shaky, uncertain. Yes. I'm Jessica. Jessica Martinez. I think we need to talk. My blood turned to ice. Jessica, the other woman. The one living in the Bellevue apartment, sharing the life Mark had built with stolen money. I know who you are, I said quietly. Tears began streaming down her face. I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know he was married. Not until yesterday when he told me about the divorce and the frozen accounts and... She broke down completely. Against every instinct screaming at me to slam the door, I let her in. We sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where this nightmare had started, while she told me her story. I met Mark 8 months ago at a conference in Vancouver. He said he was divorced, that his ex-wife got the house in the settlement. He was charming and successful and... She wiped her eyes. I'm so stupid. You're not stupid, I said, surprising myself with the compassion in my voice. You're another one of his victims. He told me the apartment was temporary while he looked for a house to buy. He said the consulting business was his way of building independence after his divorce. Jessica's voice cracked. I even helped him set up the business bank account. A key piece of the puzzle clicked into place. You have access to the Sterling consulting account? She nodded miserably. I've been doing the books. I thought I was helping my boyfriend build his future. Instead, I was helping him steal from his wife. Jessica, I said carefully, I need you to understand something. That money Mark's been spending on you, on the apartment, on your life together. It was stolen from our joint accounts. Money I earned, money that belonged to both of us. She buried her face in her hands. What kind of person does that make me? A person who was lied to and manipulated by an expert. I leaned forward. But you can help me stop him from hurting anyone else. She looked up, hope flickering in her tear-stained eyes. How? Testify. Help us recover what's left of the money. Help me make sure he faces consequences for what he's done. By the time Jessica left, we had a plan. She would meet with Amanda and Rachel Monday morning before the hearing. She would provide account access, transaction records, and sworn testimony about Mark's deception. As I watched her drive away, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not for my marriage, that was dead and buried, but for justice. For accountability. For the satisfaction of watching Mark's carefully constructed lies crumble around him. Monday morning was coming, and I was ready for war. The King County Superior Court hearing room felt like a gladiator arena as we assembled Monday morning. The morning light streaming through tall windows that made the polished wood and brass fixtures gleam with an almost sacred authority. The room was designed to intimidate, with its high ceilings, imposing judge's bench, and gallery seating that could accommodate dozens of observers. Today, thankfully, we had the space mostly to ourselves, just the essential players in what had become a very expensive and very public game of chess. Mark sat beside Brad Morrison, impeccably dressed as always in what I now recognized as his power suit, a charcoal wool Armani with a subtle pinstripe that had cost more than most people's monthly rent. His tie was perfectly knotted, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, his hair styled with the kind of precision that required professional maintenance. But I could see the strain around his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands occasionally trembled before he clasped them together in his lap. He'd aged years in the past few days, and for the first time since this nightmare began, he looked genuinely afraid. Brad Morrison was exactly what I'd expected from Sarah's descriptions. Silver-haired, expensively dressed, and carrying himself with the kind of arrogant confidence that came from winning cases through intimidation and legal maneuvering rather than justice. He whispered constantly to Mark, their heads bent together like conspirators planning their next move. Occasionally, Morrison would glance in my direction with the kind of dismissive look that suggested he considered me a minor obstacle to be brushed aside. Judge Patricia Hendricks had a reputation for no-nonsense efficiency and zero tolerance for financial fraud in divorce cases, which was exactly why Amanda had requested her specifically for this hearing. Hendricks had spent 15 years as a prosecutor before being appointed to the bench 12 years ago, with a particular specialty in white-collar crime that had made her a terror to defendants who thought they could outsmart the system. She was a small woman in her early 60s, but her presence filled the courtroom with the kind of authority that made even experienced lawyers straighten their ties and speak more carefully. Amanda had briefed me extensively on Hendricks' background, former prosecutor who'd put away dozens of embezzlers and fraudsters, appointed to the bench with bipartisan support, known for asking penetrating questions that could unravel even the most carefully constructed lies. She had a particular hatred for spouses who tried to hide assets during divorce proceedings, having seen too many cases where one partner had been left financially destroyed, while the other walked away with hidden millions. "Your Honor," Brad Morrison began, his silver hair gleaming under the courtroom lights as he stood with practiced theatrical flair. "My client is the victim of a vindictive spouse who has frozen legitimate business accounts and blocked access to funds needed for basic living expenses. Mrs. Sterling's allegations are unsubstantiated and punitive, designed to force an unfair settlement through financial coercion rather than legitimate legal proceedings." Morrison's voice carried the kind of polished authority that had probably swayed countless juries over the years. He spoke in the measured cadences of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room, his gestures calculated for maximum effect. But I noticed that he avoided making direct eye contact with Judge Hendricks, which Amanda had told me was often a sign that a lawyer knew their case was weak. Prosecutor, appointed to the bench 12 years ago with a particular hatred for spouses who tried to hide assets. "Your Honor," Brad Morrison began, his silver hair gleaming under the courtroom lights, "my client is the victim of a vindictive spouse who has frozen legitimate business accounts and blocked access to funds needed for basic living expenses. Mrs. Sterling's allegations are unsubstantiated and punitive." Judge Hendricks looked unimpressed, her sharp eyes studying Morrison with the kind of skeptical attention that suggested she'd heard this exact speech dozens of times before. She made a few notes on her legal pad, each stroke of her pen deliberate and precise. "Mr. Morrison, I've reviewed the emergency motions filed by Mrs. Sterling's counsel. The allegations include wire fraud, embezzlement, and systematic asset dissipation over a period of months. These aren't vindictive claims based on marital discord. They're serious criminal accusations backed by forensic financial evidence compiled by a certified fraud examiner with 20 years of federal law enforcement experience." The judge's tone was ice cold, and I saw Morrison's confident posture deflate slightly. This wasn't going to be the routine hearing he'd probably expected, where he could intimidate the opposition and steamroll through procedural objections. Amanda stood, her navy suit crisp and authoritative, every inch the legal warrior I'd hoped to find when Sarah recommended her. She'd spent the weekend preparing for this moment, reviewing every piece of evidence, anticipating every possible objection Morrison might raise. "Your Honor, we have documented proof that Mr. Sterling has stolen over $400,000 from marital assets over the past 6 months. He created fraudulent companies with no legitimate business purpose, submitted false expense reports to his employer that inflated costs by as much as 300%, and used the stolen funds to maintain a secret apartment and relationship with another woman who was unaware of his marital status." The words hit the courtroom like artillery shells, each accusation more damning than the last. I watched Mark's face go pale, his hands gripping the edge of the defendant's table until his knuckles turned white. For the first time since this nightmare began, he looked like what he actually was, a criminal caught in the act. "That's not—" Mark started to speak, his voice cracking with panic. But Judge Hendricks cut him off with a sharp look that could have frozen hellfire. "Mr. Sterling, you'll have your chance to respond under oath. Ms. Rodriguez, present your evidence." What followed was a masterclass in financial forensics that felt like watching a surgeon perform an operation on my former life. Rachel took the stand first, her professional credentials establishing her as an unimpeachable expert witness. She had testified in federal court dozens of times, had helped recover hundreds of millions in stolen assets, and had worked cases involving some of the most sophisticated financial criminals in the country. The defendant created Sterling Consulting LLC specifically to launder marital assets, Rachel explained, her voice clear and authoritative as she pointed to exhibits displayed on the courtroom's large monitor. The documents showed a web of transfers, so complex it looked like a money laundering operation from a crime thriller. The company has no legitimate business purpose, no clients, no services provided, no business plan, no operating agreement, no commercial insurance, no business licenses. It exists solely as a vehicle to move money out of joint accounts controlled by both spouses into accounts controlled exclusively by Mr. Sterling. Rachel walked the court through bank records, transfer patterns, and hidden accounts with the precision of a GPS system tracking a route through unfamiliar territory. Every transaction was documented, every transfer explained, every suspicious pattern highlighted and analyzed. She showed how Mark had deliberately kept individual transfers below federal reporting thresholds, how he'd used multiple banks to obscure the paper trail, how he'd created fake invoices and business expenses to justify the movements of money. Furthermore, Rachel continued, pulling up a new set of documents, we discovered that Mr. Sterling has been submitting fraudulent expense reports to his employer, TechFlow Dynamics. Hotel bills for business trips that should have cost $200 per night were inflated to $600. Restaurant receipts for supposed client dinners totaling $800 occurred on weekends when Mr. Sterling told his wife he was working alone at the office. Car rental expenses for trips that should have required compact vehicles were billed as luxury SUVs. Then came Jessica's testimony, which proved to be the nuclear bomb that obliterated Mark's remaining credibility. Mark's face went ashen when she entered the courtroom, his composure finally cracking completely as he realized that the woman he'd been using as an unwitting accomplice was about to become his most damaging witness. Jessica had spent the weekend working with Amanda and Rachel, providing access to accounts, documents, and records that painted a picture of systematic deception that went far beyond simple marital infidelity. "Ms. Martinez," Amanda said gently, recognizing that Jessica was as much a victim in this scenario as I was. "Can you describe your relationship with the defendant?" "Mark told me he was divorced," Jessica said, her voice stronger than I'd expected but still trembling with emotion. She'd dressed conservatively for court, a simple black dress and jacket that made her look younger and more vulnerable than she actually was. He said his ex-wife had gotten the house in the settlement, and he was starting over. He seemed devastated by the divorce, said it had been ugly and expensive, and that he was trying to rebuild his life and his finances. Jessica's testimony revealed the elaborate fiction Mark had constructed around his relationship with her. He'd told her that his ex-wife was vindictive and had taken everything in the divorce settlement. He'd claimed that Sterling Consulting was his attempt to build financial independence after being cleaned out by divorce proceedings. He'd even shown her fake legal documents that purported to be from his divorce settlement, documents that Rachel had later determined were completely fabricated. "Did Mr. Sterling ever tell you where the money for Sterling Consulting came from?" Amanda asked. "He said it was his savings from before the divorce, plus loans from friends who believed in his business idea." Jessica's voice broke slightly. "He showed me bank statements that seemed to prove the money was legitimately his. I never questioned it because he seemed so successful, so confident. He talked about his work at TechFlow, about the important projects he was managing, about the promotion he was expecting. Ms. Martinez, do you now understand where that money actually came from?" "Yes. He stole it from Mrs. Sterling. From their joint accounts, from the life they built together." Tears streamed down Jessica's face. "I unknowingly helped him commit fraud against his own wife. I opened accounts. I deposited checks. I even helped him create fake business records to make Sterling Consulting look legitimate." Brad Morrison's cross-examination was brutal, but ultimately ineffective, like watching a skilled surgeon operate with dull instruments. He tried to paint Jessica as a gold digger who had knowingly participated in fraud, but her genuine remorse and detailed documentation made his attack seem cruel rather than convincing. Jessica had brought copies of every document, every text message, every piece of evidence that showed how completely Mark had deceived her. She'd even recorded phone conversations where Mark continued to lie about his marital status even after she'd begun to suspect the truth. "Ms. Martinez," Morrison said, his voice dripping with professional skepticism. "Isn't it true that you knew Mr. Sterling was married and chose to participate in this relationship anyway?" "That's absolutely false," Jessica replied, her voice gaining strength as her anger overcame her nervousness. "I would never knowingly have a relationship with a married man. When I finally learned the truth, I immediately ended our relationship and came forward to help Mrs. Sterling recover what was stolen from her." Morrison's attempts to discredit Jessica only served to highlight the depth of Mark's deception. Every question revealed another layer of lies, another carefully constructed falsehood designed to manipulate and control. By the time Morrison finished his cross-examination, Jessica appeared sympathetic and credible, while Mark looked like a master manipulator who had victimized multiple women simultaneously. Finally, it was Mark's turn to testify. Under oath, with his hand on the Bible and the full weight of federal perjury laws hanging over his head, he tried to maintain his innocence. But the evidence was overwhelming, the documentation irrefutable, and his explanation sounded increasingly desperate as Amanda systematically dismantled each of his claims. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Hendricks said, her patience clearly exhausted after listening to 20 minutes of Mark's increasingly implausible explanations. "Are you seriously asking this court to believe that you created a shell company, moved $400,000 of marital assets into accounts your wife couldn't access, maintained a secret residence with another woman, submitted fraudulent expense reports to your employer, and created fake business documents, all as part of legitimate business activities?" Mark's face was flushed with panic and humiliation as he realized that his carefully constructed web of lies was collapsing around him. "Your Honor, the financial situation is more complex than it appears. There were tax advantages to structuring things through Sterling Consulting, and the apartment was temporary while I searched for a permanent residence that would be appropriate for Mr. Sterling. I've been on this bench for 12 years. I've seen every scheme, every excuse, every attempt to justify financial fraud in divorce proceedings. What you've done isn't complex business planning, it's theft. Systematic, premeditated theft from your spouse conducted over a period of months, with the apparent intention of leaving her financially devastated while you walked away with assets that legally belonged to both of you. The judge's ruling was swift, comprehensive, and more satisfying than I had dared to hope. All asset freezes remained in place permanently until a complete accounting could be performed. Mark was ordered to provide complete financial disclosure within 72 hours, including all bank accounts, investment portfolios, cryptocurrency wallets, and business entities he had created or participated in. Any attempt to access, transfer, or hide additional assets would result in immediate contempt of court charges and potential jail time. Most satisfying of all, Judge Hendricks referred the case to both the King County Prosecutor's Office and the FBI's Economic Crimes Unit for potential criminal charges. Furthermore, Judge Hendricks continued, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, Mr. Sterling is ordered to immediately cease and desist from any contact with Sterling Consulting LLC or any other business entities created during the marriage. All assets held by these entities are considered marital property subject to equitable distribution. The defendant is also ordered to surrender all credit cards, debit cards, and access devices related to joint accounts, and is prohibited from incurring any new debt in the plaintiff's name. As we left the courthouse, Amanda walked beside me, her satisfaction evident in every confident step. The Seattle afternoon was crisp and clear, the kind of day that made the city sparkle like a jewel against Puget Sound. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe deeply without the crushing weight of uncertainty and betrayal constricting my chest. That went better than I hoped, Amanda said, adjusting her briefcase as we descended the courthouse steps. Judge Hendricks doesn't just award monetary damages, she sends messages. Mark's going to become a cautionary tale for other spouses who think they can hide assets during divorce proceedings. What about criminal charges? I asked, still processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. Given the amount of money involved, the sophistication of the scheme, and the fact that he committed fraud against both you and his employer, I'd say criminal charges are not just likely, but inevitable. Wire fraud carries a maximum sentence of 20 years in federal prison. Add in tax evasion, embezzlement, and potentially money laundering charges, and he's looking at serious federal time if convicted. Outside the courthouse, Mark caught up with me as I walked to my car, his expensive shoes clicking against the concrete with the same measured precision he'd once brought to every aspect of our life together. Jessica had left through another exit, wisely avoiding any confrontation that might compromise her status as a cooperating witness in what was certain to become a federal criminal investigation. "Olivia, please," he said, his voice desperate in a way I'd never heard before. The confident executive mask had completely dissolved, leaving behind a man who looked genuinely terrified of what his future now held. "We can work this out. I made mistakes, serious mistakes, but we don't have to destroy each other. We can negotiate a settlement that's fair to both of us." I turned to face him. This man I'd loved for 12 years, shared dreams with, built a life alongside, and felt nothing but a cold, distant pity. The anger that had sustained me through the investigation and court proceedings had burned itself out, leaving behind something cleaner and more final than rage. "Mark, you destroyed us the moment you decided to steal from me. The moment you moved another woman into an apartment paid for with our money. The moment you looked me in the eye every morning and lied about working late while you were actually building a secret life with stolen funds. I can explain everything," he started, but I held up a hand to stop him. "No, you've had months to explain, and instead, you chose to lie, steal, and manipulate. You can explain to the FBI when they investigate your wire fraud charges. You can explain to the IRS when they audit your tax returns and discover all those inflated business expenses. You can explain to TechFlow's board of directors when they investigate how much money you've stolen from the company through false expense reports. His face went pale as he realized the full scope of what was about to happen to him. "You're going to destroy my career, my reputation, everything I've worked for." "I'm not destroying anything, Mark. I'm just stopping you from destroying anyone else. You did this to yourself the moment you decided that our marriage vows, our shared assets, and our mutual trust were just obstacles to overcome in pursuit of whatever fantasy life you thought you deserved." As I drove home through Seattle's familiar streets, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not happiness. That would come later. But the deep satisfaction of someone who had fought for herself and won. 6 months later, the dissolution of Sterling versus Sterling was finalized on a crisp April morning that felt like the first day of spring after the longest winter of my life. The cherry trees around the courthouse were in full bloom, their pink petals creating a carpet of renewal on the sidewalks. Mark had agreed to a settlement that restored every penny he'd stolen, plus punitive damages that essentially doubled the financial penalty for his fraud. The final agreement included clauses that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier: full restitution, lifetime alimony that couldn't be modified downward, and my exclusive ownership of assets we'd once shared. He'd been terminated from. TechFlow Dynamics, after their internal investigation, revealed not just the fraudulent expense reports we'd uncovered, but a pattern of financial misconduct going back almost 2 years. The company had also referred his case to federal prosecutors, adding corporate fraud charges to the growing list of crimes he was facing. Federal prosecutors had filed charges for wire fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering, with a trial date set for September. His legal team was already discussing plea bargain options that would likely result in significant prison time and massive financial penalties. Jessica had cooperated fully with all investigations and had been granted immunity. In exchange for her testimony, she'd returned to Portland to start over with a new job at a nonprofit organization that helped victims of financial fraud, a career change that Amanda thought was both appropriate and probably therapeutic. The last I'd heard, she was doing well and had started dating someone who was actually divorced. I stood in the kitchen of my Queen Anne home, now legally and completely mine according to the final decree, reading the dissolution documents that officially ended 12 years of marriage. The morning light streaming through the windows felt different now, cleaner and brighter, as if the house itself had been purged of the shadows that Mark's deception had cast over every room. After 12 years of marriage, it was over. Not the way I'd planned when I'd first suspected something was wrong, but with a finality that felt like closure rather than defeat. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Lunch at Canlis to celebrate. Your freedom? I'm buying champagne." "Perfect," I replied, smiling at the phone in a way that felt natural for the first time in months. "I have news to share. Refined Spaces had not only survived the chaos and publicity of my divorce, but had thrived in ways I never could have anticipated. The high-profile case had generated unexpected media attention, positioning me as someone who fought for herself and won against overwhelming odds. New clients were calling weekly, drawn by my reputation for strength, integrity, and the kind of attention to detail that came from someone who'd learned to question everything and trust her instincts. Several articles in design magazines had profiled my work and my story, leading to opportunities I never would have had as Mark Sterling's wife. But my biggest news was personal, and it involved someone I'd known peripherally for years without ever really seeing him clearly. 2 weeks ago, I'd accepted a dinner invitation from David Chen, Sarah's older brother, and a successful architect whose own firm specialized in sustainable design and historic renovation. Our first dinner had lasted 4 hours, filled with the kind of easy conversation and genuine laughter that I'd forgotten I was capable of experiencing. He was everything Mark had pretended to be: honest, funny, intellectually curious, and completely uninterested in games or manipulation. "You're glowing," Sarah said when we met for lunch at Canlis, the elegant restaurant perched on a hill overlooking Lake Union. Her shrewd eyes took in my new haircut, shorter and more confident, my updated wardrobe that reflected my own taste, rather than what Mark thought was appropriate, and the general air of confidence that seemed to radiate from every pore. I feel like myself again, I admitted, looking out at the Seattle skyline that no longer seemed threatening or alien. For the first time in years, maybe for the first time ever, I feel like I know exactly who I am and what I want. And what? About David? Sarah asked, her investigative journalist instincts homing in on the topic I'd been hoping to discuss. I couldn't suppress my smile, which felt like sunshine breaking through clouds that had been gathering for years. David is wonderful, patient, honest, funny, creative, everything Mark pretended to be but never actually was. Have you heard anything about Mark lately? His trial is scheduled for September. Amanda thinks he'll plea bargain, probably serve 18 months in federal prison. I sipped my wine, feeling no satisfaction in his downfall, just relief that it was over. Jessica sent me a card last week. She's doing well, working for a nonprofit in Portland. She's grateful we didn't let her get dragged down with him. You saved her too, you know, Sarah said. If you hadn't caught him when you did, he probably would have destroyed her life as well. That afternoon, I drove to my office with the windows down, Seattle's spring air washing away the last remnants of the woman who had sat in her kitchen 6 months ago, staring at divorce papers and sensing something was wrong. That woman had trusted her instincts, fought for herself, and emerged stronger than she ever imagined possible. My phone rang as I pulled into my parking space. David's name flashed on the screen. "How did the lunch celebration go?" he asked. Warmth evident in his voice. "Perfect. How's your afternoon looking? Clear? Want to take a walk around Green Lake? I have something I want to discuss with you." Sounds mysterious? Not mysterious. Exciting. At least, I hope you'll think so. An hour later, we walked the familiar path around Green Lake, my hand in his, talking about a potential collaboration, his architectural firm and my design company working together on a luxury development project. It would mean spending a lot of time together, David said, stopping to face me. Professionally and personally. Are you ready for that? I looked into his honest brown eyes, so different from Mark's calculating gray ones, and felt my heart open, in a way I'd thought might never happen again. "I'm ready for whatever comes next," I said. As the sun set over Seattle's skyline, painting the lake in shades of gold and pink, I realized that Mark's betrayal had given me something unexpected, the knowledge that I was strong enough to survive anything, strong enough to fight for myself, strong enough to start over. The woman who had frozen those bank accounts and exposed her husband's lies wasn't just protecting herself. She was creating space for the person she was meant to become. Independent, confident, unafraid. My husband had tried to rush the divorce, thinking he could leave me with nothing. Instead, he'd given me everything: my freedom, my strength, and most importantly, my future. And that future was just beginning.